Okay, let's talk about carbohydrates. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the basic science behind carbohydrates, the different categories, and I also am really hoping that when you complete this presentation, you have a good sense of the importance of carbohydrates because we do hear some conflicting messages out there in our everyday lives. Ultimately, it's mostly about quality and quantity of carbohydrates. When you hear the word carbohydrate, what kinds of foods pop into your mind? I put a few here that I think are probably some of the most common foods that pop into people's minds, although I do hope by the end of this presentation many other foods pop into your mind. So basically we have baked goods, fruit, bread, and candy or sweets that are probably most commonly affiliated with carbohydrates. And I think because of this, we have this not vilification, but sometimes a less positive view of carbohydrates in our diet. The word carbohydrate means carbon and water, and we usually break carbohydrates down into two categories, simple and complex. So let's jump in and start talking about the different types of carbohydrates. So monosaccharides are the simplest type of carbohydrate, and we have glucose, fructose, and galactose. Glucose is a single sugar used in both plant and animal tissues for energy. You may also hear it called blood sugar or dextrose. Fructose is the intensely sweet sugar that we taste in fruit, honey, and it is also part of table sugar. You may also hear it called fruit sugar. Galactose is one of the sugars that is bound together to make up milk sugar. It doesn't occur naturally, but is tied up in milk sugar and freed during digestion. I'm going to spend a little more time talking about glucose now because there is so much to talk about. I could probably do a whole presentation just on glucose and the many things about it. For one, as you can see here, there is the consideration of when you have too little glucose, and then of course the consideration of when you've had too much glucose in your body, and there are very different responses in the body based on whether you've had too little or too much. What happens when you have too little glucose in your system? Well, we usually call that hypoglycemia, or your blood sugar is low and basically you need to eat something. I like to call that being hangry in my case because when my blood sugar is low, I have a very emotional reaction to that. Today, especially in public health nutrition, we're much more concerned about too much glucose in the system. And that means that somebody would be hyperglycemic. This is usually people who are pre-diabetic or diabetic, and essentially this affects the ability of the pancreas to secrete enough insulin to keep up with the amount of food and glucose coming into the body. One last note about glucose is basically that foods that are high in simple sugars do get into the bloodstream faster and give us a burst of energy, but when you eat really highly sugary foods, you often will get that kind of sugar crash that follows it, and that has to do with how the body processes and then stores glucose later down the line. Luckily for us, there is a wonderful tool that we can use called the glycemic index, and basically this is a ranking of foods according to their potential for raising blood sugar compared to glucose itself, and it is a scale up to 100 where glucose would be 100 on the scale. Foods that are a little bit higher on the glycemic index are simple sugars that are likely to cause that kind of spike in blood sugar and crash I was just talking about. And basically foods that have a low glycemic index are more complex and will release glucose more slowly and steadily in your body. This table does a really nice job of showing a great variety of foods and where they fall on the glycemic index. It's also broken down by the categories that we're usually used to seeing in the dietary guidelines. So they're listed in ascending order with the lowest glycemic index foods at the top of each list in the sections, and then they get higher as you go down. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick glucose break and we're going to move over to fructose. And one thing that people immediately think of when they think of fructose is naturally occurring fructose versus what we think of as commercial sweeteners or high fructose corn syrup. And basically, natural fructose can be found in plants, as I mentioned before. And when it's used commercially, it's usually pulled from sugar cane, sugar beets, and corn. High fructose corn syrup is a mixture of glucose and fructose, and that actually is also what makes up table sugar or sucrose. And when it comes to high fructose corn syrup, there are different mixes of those two things, some with a higher concentration of fructose and some with a higher concentration of glucose. Regular table sugar, or sucrose, is a perfect 50-50 mix. Moving on to the disaccharides. We have lactose, which is milk sugar, and that's glucose linked with galactose. Maltose, which appears wherever starch is being broken down and arises during the digestion of starch in the human body. So we see that in beer, cereal, pasta, and potatoes, for example. And then we have good old sucrose, which we also call table sugar. And that's the combination of glucose and fructose, as I mentioned before. And this is refined by the juice from sugar beets, sugar cane, and also occurs naturally in many vegetables and fruits. On to polysaccharides, which are much more complex, and we have glycogen, starch, and fiber. Let's start with glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose in our bodies. So how is it stored in our bodies? Basically, when you eat a meal, the increase of glucose in your blood triggers your pancreas to secrete the hormone insulin. Once insulin is released, it signals the cells and tissues to take up surplus glucose for storage, and that can go to the muscles, the liver, and a little bit to the brain. Our muscles have a very specific purpose for how they use this stored glycogen, but our liver can actually release glycogen when our glucose levels get too low. If your liver is releasing glycogen, that means that you're on a very limited supply and it would be good to eat something as soon as possible. The amount being stored in the liver can really be depleted in just a half of a waking day. Just like glycogen is the storage form of glucose in animal bodies, starch is the storage form of glucose in plants. It's pretty tricky for us to digest starch in its raw form, but cooking starch can make it much more digestible. Fiber is one of my favorite things to talk about, and we always break it down into two categories, soluble and insoluble. Soluble just means that it is something that can dissolve in water, and a few examples of that would be barley, fruits, oats, and some vegetables, and they're pretty easy for our colon to break down. Insoluble fibers are a little harder for our body to break down, or at least we break it down a little bit differently. So things like brown rice, legumes, vegetables like cabbage, Brussels sprouts, wheat bran, and whole grains. A good example of an insoluble fiber would be a kernel of corn, so we can eat it and chew it and digest it, but it digests very differently, and I think you know exactly what I mean. And I have to give fiber one last little shout out, which is the many wonderful health benefits of eating fiber. So things like lowering your cholesterol, it can help you regulate your blood glucose, which we've talked about a ton. The wheat bran that we eat is the stool softening food extraordinaire, and it truly can help to maintain a healthy body weight. Some people wonder, can you eat too much fiber, which is very rarely an issue because most Americans are getting nowhere near what they need in their fiber intake. But the best thing to do is to introduce fiber slowly to your diet and not eat too much all at once to avoid any kind of stomach trouble or pain and bloating. So one thing you may be curious about is what exactly would it take to get the daily recommended amount of fiber in your diet? I won't go into a crazy amount of detail, but you can see by the pictures here that if you kind of followed a daily diet that looks something like this, with some kind of whole grain for breakfast with a banana, almonds, some sort of whole wheat grain for lunch, yogurt as a snack, fish for dinner with a veggie side, and even a popcorn snack, you could get plenty of fiber in your day, and these are just a few examples of how you could meet your daily goal of 20 to 35 grams of fiber. Hopefully now you know how important carbohydrates are to your body. Just like most things in life, you don't want to overdo it, but if you just follow Michael Pollan's classic advice, eat food, not too much, mostly plants, you'll be in really good shape.